Hi everyone, welcome to today's lesson on rebuttals and your rebuttal speech. If you haven't already, feel free to check out the previous videos. There's already some videos on what big questions is and the constructive speech, which is your first speech where you kind of lay all the arguments out on the table, as well as flowing, so how to flow a debate. So feel free to check those out before moving in today's lesson, but here we go. All right, so what is the purpose of a rebuttal, or what is a rebuttal? So what a rebuttal aims to do is to refute the contents of your opponent's case. So pretty much, why are you right and why are they wrong? The way your rebuttal speech looks, however, is dependent on if you're on the affirmative side or the negative side. So if you're on the affirmative side, just like we saw in this debate outline, so the affirmative constructive goes first, then the negative. Then there's a questioning segment where both sides ask questions for 3 minutes together. Then the affirmative rebuttal goes first. So in 4 minutes, they're rebutting all of their opponent's contents. And if they've done everything and they still have time left over, they can go back and talk about why their points are better than the opponent's as well. Kind of talk more about their case. The negative rebuttal, however, has an advantage or disadvantage, depends on how you look at it. Because when they come up to do their rebuttal, they've already heard the affirmative's rebuttal against their case. So they have two jobs. They have to rebut the affirmative's constructive speech, and if time allows, they also have to defend the affirmative's rebuttals against their speech. So I personally think that is a positive because you can make those defenses in an earlier speech rather than having to do it in your consolidation like affirmative does on top of the overall summary. That is what a consolidation is. So just keep that in mind as you progress throughout the debate. So no matter which type of rebuttal you use, you want to always somehow be thinking about comparisons, because at the end of the day, I tell my kiddos that there are two main rebuttals. There is just a factual rebuttal where you're rebutting the contents of the other person's case, and then there's the outweighing rebuttal. So the way that looks is like this. So let's say I'm on the affirmative and I say, according to my opponent's contention 1, they say blah blah blah. However, this is not true because of blah blah blah. Then there's a second type of rebuttal you can utilize, which is, however, judge, if you still agree with their point that blah, blah, blah is true, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter to this debate, because let's say I'm talking about lives being impacted and they're talking about the possibility of you being a little bit happier. At the end of the day, lives matter a lot more than happiness. So that's also a type of rebuttal called weighing. You're weighing the impacts of each side. So just to recap, there are offensive arguments, so you're rebutting their case. There are defensive arguments, so you're defending your case by kind of attacking the rebuttals made against you. And then there are those weighing mechanisms as well. Okay, there are also specific types within these three categories. There's a specific type of rebuttal called a non-unique. So these are claims about what's kind of happening right now. So here's an example. You would say, their argument is non-unique. They say affirming will decrease depression, but there are so many other factors that more heavily influence depression, such as blank, blank, and blank. So if your opponent is saying X will decrease depression, all you have to say is, that's like one of the 100 factors, and it's one of the most minuscule factors. So it's not really unique compared to the other factors that more heavily influence it. And if you can prove a more heavily influence, then you also outweigh as well. D-links. So if you watched the other day's lesson about a constructive speech, we talked about link chains. So link chains is where you go from A to B, B to C, C to D, and D to E, right? So from how you're connecting your claim to your impact. So a D-link is, let's say I refuted C to D, part of that link chain. Then the whole thing starts to crumble. So that would be a D-link argument. You would say, here's an example. So my opponent says religion causes war, but this card says 98% of wars are caused by non-religious motives, and less than 2% of all war deaths. So, therefore, we still have more of the population accessing these benefits. So again, this allows you to also segue into outweighing 98% versus 2%. So you're delinking the part about religion causing war. If there is a more broad link chain, like A to B, B to C, C to D, D to E, and you delink D to E, you would say, Judge, we already proved that D to E is not true, so that means A cannot lead to E, right? That would be another way to do that for a more expanded upon link chain. Turns. So turns are probably one of the trickiest things to do in a debate, but they are also probably one of the most effective. So a turn also kind of goes into delinking, but let's say you have A to B, B to C, C to D, D to E, and you say C doesn't actually lead to D, C leads to F, and then F leads to E, right? So then you are turning the opponent's arguments. So your opponent's E part, which is their impacts, those are actually going to benefit you now because you proved how somewhere in their link, instead of one point leading to the other, one point leads to a completely different point, which then leads to the impact, meaning you now get your opponent's impact. So their whole contention talking about the benefits of X, Y, and Z, now those become your points. So this is a really, really good argument if you can utilize it, and then it also gives you more weighing in the round, how you have more points you were able to prove compared to your opponent. So let's look at this example. My opponent said religious leaders use their platform to spread bad information. However, in reality, let's look at the Roman Catholic Pope. He told Catholics to go and get the COVID-19 vaccine, and 85% of them did. And then you would turn all the impacts about that your opponent said about why it's so important to get vaccines and all of this stuff, that would become your impacts now because religion is influencing people to get vaccines and saving lives. So then by turning a link, you automatically kind of turn the impacts to your side as well. Let's look at another example. So my opponent argues that religion helped found the government. This is actually a bad thing because according to blah blah blah, some nations run by religious governments such as, give an example. So they use religion to persecute people part of the African American or LGBTQ community. You get the point. So if you don't want to turn a specific part of the link chain, you can actually turn the impact. So if they say this leads to this, which leads to this, which leads to that, and you say, okay, well, that is super, super bad, then that discredits their whole contention and shows why their point is actually harming society and having negative impacts. So that's another way you can utilize turns as well. So here are some no-nos that you don't want to do in a debate. So don't read turns that are then going to end up hurting you. So if my opponent is saying A to B, B to C, and I say, actually, no, it's A to B, B to D, D to C, and then I also say, but C is really bad, then I'm technically hurting my case. So choose whichever one of those rebuttals you prefer. However, what I said earlier where you say, hey, this thing that my opponent is saying is false, however, if you still believe it, it's technically not even a good impact, that's okay because that's not hurting you, right? But if you're turning the argument and saying, actually, no, it's my side that's causing that impact, but then you say the impact is bad, then again, you're hurting yourself in your case. You do not want to do that. So the example I just gave, you could see down here. So I say, Judge, my opponent said X, which isn't true because Z. However, even if you do buy that argument, we outweigh more because of Y. So here's a real-world example that I used one year. Judge, my opponent said religious leaders use their platform to spread information. However, this isn't true because of this card. However, even if you do agree that that argument that religious leaders do sometimes use their platform to spread information, we outweigh more because our card shows that more people listen to Pope Francis, which told his followers to get vaccine, and the amount of people who got that vaccine significantly outweighed than my opponent's example of this guy saying something to his followers and them not getting the vaccine. So we still outweigh, meaning religion is still doing more good than harm. So you can do that. Implications. So implications are explaining how your response takes out the argument you're responding to and how that impacts overall throughout the round. You want to be super, super clear with the way you're arguing with these implications, because a lot of times, a lot of my students get caught up in knowing what they're talking about, but your judge might be hearing it for the first ever time. So keep in mind that every time you are rebutting, the more familiar you get with it, the more you might want to be more quick with it and summarize the rebuttal. But again, that's not always good for a judge who has no idea what you're talking about. So you definitely want to be clear. You always want to have implications as well, because if you don't, there's no point for you to even have that rebuttal. If your rebuttal doesn't have an implication or a point or a reason why it matters, then newsflash, it doesn't matter. So you want to make sure you do have that in your card, or in your rebuttal card. And the reason you want to tell your judge why your impact even matters is because at the end of the day, they're making the decision on whose side makes the more sense, has the most impact. So if you don't talk about why your argument makes sense, why your argument has an impact, then you might as well not be debating at all. So implications has a lot to do with the why aspect. It's also kind of like the warranting and impact of your constructive speech if you saw the first video of this lesson series. So there are multiple types of rebuttals you can have. So you can come up with a rebuttal on the spot by making a logical inference. So one year we were debating if math is discovered or invented, and someone was talking about how math is invented because you came up with something like the Pythagorean theorem, which is an equation. And I thought on the spot, well, that works for all right triangles. So if I go and observe a right triangle in nature, that right triangle is going to follow this formula. So technically that formula existed, we just kind of gave it a label. So that was a logical argument I thought of on the spot. I didn't have a specific source to back that up, even though I probably could have found something like that. However, so that's a good argument to use if you don't have a rebuttal for that specific argument that your opponent made, or also if you don't really have time to research mid-round, which you are allowed to do in debate. You are allowed to access the internet and research mid-round, but sometimes people run out of time, so if you could come up with a rebuttal, make it. It's better to make a non-backed up rebuttal than no rebuttals at all, because then your opponent automatically wins that point, even if the point is kind of bad. So if you are prepared, you have a card, a rebuttal card. So what is a card? We talked a little bit about evidence and evidence cards that go into your constructive speech, and we looked at the format of that. The format with rebuttals is similar. Again, it depends on how you want to format it. So let's look at some examples. So this is my basic card format. This is the way I used to format cards. Most people don't format it like this, so just format it any way you want. So A2 means argument 2. You don't have to have A2, you can just have the topic. You can have neither and do whatever you want. But A2 stands for argument 2, so like argument against. So I would probably using my math example, I would say argument 2 equations / Pythagorean theorem. So this card or this rebuttal is going to be what I say against my opponent who talks about equations or the Pythagorean theorem. So I have source. I usually italicize my source and underline, and I hyperlink it as well, which you can do on a Google Doc. If you don't know how to do that, you can look it up, ask a teacher, or ask me in the comments, and I can make a quick video about that as well. So according to source, or this source states, and then I put the quote of whatever the source says. And then I always like to have a this shows, this means, some sort of segue into what I want you as the judge to understand based on this rebuttal. Why does this rebuttal matter, right? Kind of like that, getting into implications again. So this means that, blah, blah, blah. So I'm inserting my explanation, why this source matters, what it means in the context of the resolution. And I also like to bold key words that I want to emphasize while I'm reading this card. So let's look at an example. So this is against someone saying that religion causes division. So in this card, I don't have it hyperlinked. I think I probably forgot to do that, but pretend the Guardian is hyperlinked. The reason you want to hyperlink it is because a lot of times in debate, people cheat, and the cards that they have, they take out words that are super important and they mislead the information. So I use the link because me and most people in debate like to actually click on the link and see the actual article or source you got it from rather than what you copy and pasted from it, because you could change it. So the Guardian states, the perception that faith is a cause of a division can often be because faith is misused for other uses and other agendas. And then I say, this means that people try to blame religion as the cause of their division, but the religious beliefs and practices themselves don't actually cause division, because religion, their beliefs and practices, don't preach division. But the people come and they twist religion to do whatever their agenda is. So the fact that people choose to hide behind religion does not fault religion itself or the rest of the followers. The blame falls squarely on the individual's choice to misinterpret it to fit their own agenda. So to say that religion causes division is actually inaccurate, right? That would be a perfect example. If I had just read what the card stated, that perception that faith is a cause of division can often be because faith is misused for other uses and other agendas, that is what the card is saying. But if you're going super fast throughout the round, your judge might miss that or miss what that actually means, which is why you always want to say this means and explain it in an easier way that you want your judge to understand. Let's look at another example. So this is a statistic rebuttal example. The link is above, but again, just try hyperlinking it. So this is again someone who's saying that religion discriminates against women. So I would say, according to Virtue Online, more female priests are joining the Church of England than male ones for the first time ever. It can be disclosed as it takes another step towards the introduction of women bishops. Official figures show that 290 women were ordained in 2010, in the most recent year for which figures are available. By contrast, just 273 men entered the priesthood. So then I would add my own this shows at the end, which you can do as well. You can either have this shows in your rebuttal, or you can just have the rebuttals quick and easy, and then mid-round you can make your own up this shows, depending on also what your opponent is saying, because you can kind of morph your this shows statement to also kind of be attacking what your opponent is saying at the same time. So I would say, this shows that churches are not discriminating against females, and in fact, there are actually more females joining the church and trying to be ordained than males the most recent year that statistics are available. So this shows a lot of progress towards decreased discrimination, and so we should be focusing on the present and what's happening now, not what happened a couple hundred years ago where women didn't have a say and definitely could not be ordained, right? So then I'm also talking about we should be focusing on right now. So I added that into my this show statement. Link rebuttal. So link rebuttal is when you need more than one source to kind of rebut what you want to say. So this kind of goes into the Pope Francis thing that I used again. So this is against the neg saying that religion is bad because leaders are using their platform, specifically with vaccines, to get people to not use vaccines, and then that kills people, right? So I would say, according to Religion News Service 21, Pope Francis issued a message on Wednesday encouraging Catholics to receive the COVID-19 vaccine, calling it a, quote, act of love. According to Olivera 21, Catholics are the religious group most vaccinated against COVID-19, According to a new national survey by the Pew Research, the survey of 10,349 U.S. adults found that 82% of self-identified Catholics had received at least one dose of the COVID-19 vaccine, compared to 75% of religiously unaffiliated adults. So this shows that religious groups do take safety precautions with COVID, and that religious leaders are using their platform for good in terms of vaccines. Not to mention, there are more Catholics who have received at least one dose of the COVID-19 vaccine compared to those who aren't religious at all, right? If we look at 82% compared to 75%. So if anything, religion is doing more good than harm when it comes to vaccines. Alright, so this is my recommendation for time allocation. Again, it varies by round. You might do 4 minutes and 4 to 0. You might do 2 to 2. You might even do 1 to 3 if your opponent literally barely has a case. So the way I typically do it for most rounds, however, is if I'm the AF, I obviously have not, like we talked about before, I haven't heard Neg's rebuttals against my case. So I'm going to spend as much time of the 4 minutes as I can rebutting their case. If I get to the very end, which sometimes does happen, especially if you're going up against an opponent with a smaller case, if I get to the end of their case and I still have a minute left, minute and a half, maybe just 30 seconds left, I am not going to just stop and say I'm done. I'm going to utilize all of my time, which you guys should be doing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my case and I'm going to say, now let's recap my case and my impacts real quick. My contention 1, I talked about this and this and this, with this as the impact. This impact is way greater than my opponent's contention 2 impact, which talks about this. So even if you don't agree with my rebuttals against their contention 2, I'm still heavily outweighing against them on this point. Next, so you can still utilize part of that 4 minutes, and therefore you're also getting ahead because you like to weigh primarily in consolidation and rationale speeches. So you're already dipping your toe in the water to set yourself up for those speeches. Neg, I usually will spend 3 minutes rebutting the AF's case and then 1 minute rebutting my rebuttals, so defending my case and weighing if I can throughout. The reason I don't break it off evenly 2-2 is because I'm already ahead on the neg because the AF hasn't heard any of my rebuttals against their case. They haven't even started defending their case against my rebuttals, like rebutting my rebuttals. They're going to have to do that in consolidation. So even though I'm only dedicating 1 out of 4 minutes to defending my case, I'm still a minute ahead compared to AF, right? And we still only get the same amount of time per round. So don't freak out as well if you don't get through all the rebutting of the rebuttals, so like your defenses that you wanted to make. Again, don't freak out if that's the case, because just know that AF hasn't even started. So. Alright, weighing. So I know I talked about this briefly a little bit earlier, but let's get into it more in depth. So there are a couple of typical weighing mechanisms that I talked about earlier, but didn't actually give the proper name for them. So magnitude has to do with how severe an impact is. So this can either be used as, for example, one of my opponents when we were debating religious beliefs and practices was talking about how religion leads to cults. I said, hey judge, here's my rebuttal against cults. However, if for some reason you still agree with my opponent, there are only 1,000 religious cults in America and only X amount of members. The magnitude of this argument is very weak compared to my arguments that impact all of society. Or you can weigh when your points are super similar and say, for example, the Pope Francis vaccines argument. If we look at how many Catholics are vaccinated, we have 82% compared to those who aren't religious at all and are vaccinated, which is 77 or 75%. So I still outweigh. Religion is still doing more harm or more good than being without religion, right? Scope. So the scope of the argument is similar to magnitude, similar with my scope, how many people your impact reaches. So these kind of intertwine a little bit. So scope would be similar to the cults, where I say this only influences X amount of people, which really, in the grand scheme of things, doesn't really matter. Or I talk about survival, which is important for everyone, whereas they only talk about, I don't know. I remember one year someone ran all 3 of their contentions on the LGBTQ community. Not that that isn't important, but in the scope of things, if we look at the LGBTQ community compared to everyone else in the world, there are more people in this group than the LGBTQ group. However, in their framework, they said we should focus on minority groups because those are the ones that actually need help. So you can definitely work around scope and magnitude through that framework. So that was a really good use of framework for them in that round. Probability. So how probable the impact really is. So a lot of people, not specifically in big questions, but when you choose to do some other debate topics such as public forum, policy, Lincoln Douglas, a lot of teams or individuals will impact out to nuclear war, the destruction of all mankind. You could say, again, the way I was talking about in rebuttals, Judge, this is not true because of blah, blah, blah. However, if you still agree with my opponent's point, the probability that this is actually going to happen and that we're going to go to nuclear war is really low. There's something called mutually assured destruction, which is a very common point with this, where they talk about this country is not going to bomb this country because this country is going to bomb them back. They don't want that to happen, right? So then that's how you can argue that. Time frame. So time frame is going to be not just how long it takes, but also what you're weighing. The rebuttal I just gave earlier that we should be focusing on now with what's going on with religion and women and discrimination now, not what happened 200 years ago, because that's not really relevant to the resolution. We should be focusing on the present. It also works with if someone, for example, in this year's topic, a common argument is creative education. But a lot of the statistics are saying by this year, this is how many people will be impacted. You can just argue with that. As much as that source might be a credible one, we can't really weigh that compared to something that's actually happening now, right? Because at the end of the day, we don't know if that's actually going to happen or not. We don't know if we might break out in World War III by the time that happens or not, right? So time frame can be used by saying we should be focusing on the now, either by disregarding the past or disregarding the future. So again, a lot of weighing intertwines arguments together, the way magnitude and scope kind of intertwine a lot. I guess probability and time frame can also intertwine a lot with the atomic bomb example. You could first say it's not probable. Second of all, it's not happening now, so why are we even really talking about it? Right? So a lot of those can intertwine. So I'm going to give you guys an example that I haven't given yet, and I want you guys to tell me which of the 4 categories it falls most into. So our impact about economic growth is a prerequisite to theirs about poverty reduction, because the government is only able to fund programs for the poor when the economy is good. I would make the argument of magnitude because the magnitude of their argument is 0 if you don't have my impacts first. So because you need this in order to access the opponent's argument, their magnitude is actually 0 compared to mine, because mine comes first. Alright, I'm going to assign homework and then I'm going to show you guys some more rebuttals from when I was competing. So for homework, I want you guys to prepare the other case. So a couple lessons ago, after constructive speech lesson, I believe, I assigned you guys homework to prep either the AF or neg for this year's resolution that creativity is a more powerful force than intelligence. So if you guys have already done that, good job. If you haven't, please try and do that, especially if you want to compete or just for practice. If you did do that, prepare the other case. So if you did AF before, now do a neg case. If you did neg before, do an AF case. Feel free to keep looking back at the videos already posted about the formatting with that. And I also want you guys to start thinking about some possible rebuttals as you research the opposing side. So I would recommend creating a list of all the possible arguments the AF can run, all the possible arguments that the neg can run, and then so then when you do create rebuttals, you at least have a list to tell you where to start. And next week's homework will be to start creating 5 rebuttals for each side, or after the next lesson's homework, it will be to create rebuttals for each side. So having that list will just prepare you for that. If not, you can always wait for next week's lesson, but at least just start thinking about that. It's also important for you when you're creating your cases, because you should be brainstorming all the possible ideas you can do for your case before actually committing to one. So make sure to do that. Now let's go and look at some example rebuttals from when I was competing. Alright, so these are the rebuttals that I went to nationals with when I was competing. So as you can see, I have 13 pages, and each page has more than one rebuttal. As we can see, there are quite a few rebuttals that I had. When I first started out though, I had maybe just a couple of pages, like 3 or 4 pages. You create rebuttals as you go. The more experience you get and the more you compete against opponents and hear new arguments, or not even new arguments, but new spins on things. Because sometimes you might create a rebuttal against, for example, vaccines, but your rebuttal, even though it's on vaccines and your opponent is talking about vaccines, sometimes your rebuttal isn't going to actually target the idea. So that is super important when working with rebuttals, because a lot of kids will just create a huge list of rebuttals. They hear the opponent use like a trigger word of a rebuttal they have, and then they'll read the rebuttal against that opponent's case. And then if you actually focus on the contents of what the opponent is arguing and the contents of what the rebuttal is saying, there's kind of a disconnect, that the rebuttal isn't actually targeting the reasoning or the specificity of what the opponent is actually arguing. So obviously rebuttals are important. You guys do want to prepare. A lot of people, like we talked about in a couple videos before, run stock arguments, which are arguments that majority of the debate circuit does run, or somehow a type of spin off them. But a lot of the ideas will remain the same, so it's still really good to have a couple rebuttals in your back pocket. But don't freak out if you go into a tournament and there's quite a few rebuttals you're adding that day. That is completely normal. So this is just, again, example. I have according to hyperlinked. So then you can click on that and it takes me to the actual source in the New York Post. And then what the quote says, end quote, and then my explanation. So got another one. Here is the link. And here I didn't have it as shows because this was pretty fairly easy to follow. So if you look at my previous video, we talked about cutting, which is you can either shrink, you can either cross out, you can either highlight the parts of the card you want to say or don't want to say. And so here is just another example. I bolded some important parts. Sometimes cards are going to be super long. Let's look at an example. Here, I have multiple rebuttals against empathy and guilt. Again, because sometimes my single rebuttal isn't going to actually target what the opponent is saying. So this hints to me that I need to focus on what the opponent is saying, because there are multiple spins on this argument. I have 2 rebuttals. I have some underlined and bolded words telling me that's probably the most important part of this whole rebuttal. So if I run out of time, to at least just talk about that, right? And then you could see the same thing as my rebuttals progress. Or here, another example is parents. I have 1, 2, 3, 4 sources just talking about a rebuttal for parents. So that also hints to me, hey, I'm going to use whichever one. I might even use 2 that best target my opponent's specific claim. Anyways, I hope seeing this put out there helps. Again, just have this in the back of your mind, thinking about it moving forward. For next week's homework, you should start doing your other case, like I said. If you've already done both cases, though, you can definitely start doing rebuttals. That being said, thank you guys for watching. I hope you have a good rest of your day.